Charlie! Lola? Charlie! Charlie and Lola! Snow is my favourite and my best.
I have this little sister Lola. She is small and very funny.
It hasn't come yet. It's not coming yet.
Today Lola is extremely excited because the man on the weather says it's going to snow.
Ooh, snow.
Lola cannot wait for the snow to come. She's got all her things ready just in case.
Snow is my favourite and is my best.
Remember, Lola, snow can only come when it's very, very cold. Dad said it might not snow till midnight or even tomorrow.
I know, but it is extremely cold right now. So I think the snow will come sooner rather than midnight.
Hello, Charlie Summer speaking.
Hello, Charlie. Man on the weather says it's going to snow.
I know.
Tonight. So me and Sizzles meet you in the park.
Right.
Don't forget your sledge.
Bye then.
Yes! Is it snowing yet?
No.
When the snow comes, will I hear it?
No, snow is very, very quiet.
And can you eat it?
You could sort of eat it, but it tastes of, cold.
And where does it come from, the snow?
It comes from the sky.
When it falls, does it fall slowly? Or does it fall really, really quickly? Where in the sky does it come from? Can I catch it in my hands? Do you think it has started snowing now, Charlie?
No, go to sleep, Lola.
I can't, because it might come when I'm asleep, sleeping. I'll just have to check.
You've already checked 50 times.
I'll just do one more check. No, not yet.
See? Go to sleep. Lola?
Just checking. It's snowing. It's snowing. Ooh. Charlie, come quick. It's snowing. It's really, really snowing. Can we go out and play in it now?
Not now, Lola. Wait until morning, then there'll be more snow. And we can go on a sledge with Marv and Sizzle. You can build a snowman if you want.
Yes, I will build a snow dog like Sizzles.
Shh, go to sleep.
I love snow, Charlie. Ooh. Charlie! Get up, Charlie! Mum, Dad, it's all gone extremely white.
So Mum and Dad took us to the park. And Lola was right. Everything had turned extremely, completely white.
I love snow. Snow is my favourite and my best. I know. It's my best too. Crunch, crunch.
Hello!
It's fantastic, isn't it?
Where's Sizzles?
Yes, where's Sizzles? Yes, where is Sizzles? He's here. Look. Oh, good boy. Well, what shall we do now?
Charlie. Wow. Good work, everyone.
I love hot chocolate. And I love snow. I love snow. Tomorrow I might put Snow Dog and Sizzles on the sledge for a ride. And I'm going to make a snow kennel out of snow for a snow doggy. Oh, what about snow puppies? Yes, we can have lots of snow puppies. It's gone. All the lovely snow is absolutely gone. There's no more white, Charlie. It's cold and wet and brown. And Snow Dog's gone.
No. Come on. That'll take us home.
But I want the snow all the time. Why can't we have snow every day?
Because it wouldn't be special. Look, imagine you had a birthday every day. So you had parties and cakes and presents every single day.
What's wrong with having birthdays every day?
It wouldn't be a treat, would it?
Why can't we have snow every day?
Because it wouldn't be special. I'm not sure you would like snow every day.
I would, Charlie. Snow is my favourite and is my best.
OK, well, imagine completely white lands where it's snowy and cold every day. We learnt about it in school. It's called the Arctic.
Arctic?
Yeah. And there's snow everywhere.
Wow.
And look, there are reindeer and snowy owls and...
Oh, look at the polar bear. What's he doing, Charlie?
He's going for a swim.
I'd like to go swimming. Where's the beach?
There isn't a beach, Lola.
Oh.
Far too cold for us to do swimming. And then there's this place, not called the Arctic, but called the Antarctic, where you get seals and whales and...
penguins! Don't the penguins look smart, Charlie? They look like they're going to a party. I wish I was wearing my best, smartest party dress. You know, the stripy one.
You couldn't possibly wear your stripy dress in the Antarctic. You have to wear your coat the whole time because it's so cold.
Oh, yes. I forgot.
But when it's all snowy, you can do this. Whoa!
Whee!
Wow, isn't it amazing? You having fun, Lola?
Yes, Charlie. But can we go home now?
Yeah, but why? I thought snow was your favourite and was your best.
I do like it, Charlie, but I'm just a little chilly.
OK, then.
Charlie, snow is my favourite and is my best. But if it was snowy like that all the time, there would be lots of things you couldn't do.
Yes, Lola.
And here it's quite nice because sometimes there's snow and sometimes there isn't.
Yes?
So we're maybe lucky, aren't we? We can do swimming and have stripy dresses and we have snow.
Yes.
But I do feel a little sad that the snow has all gone.
I've got a surprise for you.
Really?
Don't look round. There.
A teeny-weeny snowman who lives in the freezer. How did he get in there?
I don't know.
He's melting.
Oh, shall I put him back in the freezer so we can keep him?
Oh no, Charlie. Let's watch him melt.
That could take hours.
I don't mind.